Over the years, as I've shared a lot of photo books, I've shared a lot of work from Sage Sohier, one of my all time favorite photographers. And today I'm super excited to be sharing a conversation that I had with her just a few days ago. We talk all about her approach to making pictures, approaching people, making photo books. It's a really good conversation, and I'm super excited for you all to hear it. So, big thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. I'll tell you more about them in a little bit, but let's get into this conversation. Anyone who has regularly been watching the channel, I'm sure they've been familiar with your work through videos that I've done on your books and things, but it's an honor to have you. And I'm sure everyone, myself included, would love to just hear a little bit about sort of how you kind of found photography and what about photography it was that really just kind of captivated you. What kept you going?
I think that I remember my parents gave me a Instamatic camera, one of these little box cameras when I was a kid, and then I think they gave me an SLR, a Pentax SLR, when I was maybe 14, because I loved to just wander around and leave the family and take pictures. It was like a great way of escaping the family and going off by myself and kind of exploring the world, even if I was only 100 feet away. It was like a good excuse. So I think that's how it all started. And then I did a little darkroom work when I was in high school. And then in college, I started photographing for the college newspaper. I didn't really know about art photography. I knew about photojournalism. And I always thought, that maybe I'd be a writer someday, but I didn't really understand about photography. And so I took my first photo class when I was a sophomore in college. And that was a revelation. It was with someone named Dick Rogers, who was a filmmaker by that point, and just the way he talked about pictures and all that was in the pictures. And I started looking at a bunch of photo books, and so that was the beginning of everything. And then I took a year off and photographed a lot. And I was lucky enough in my senior year in college to have Todd Papageorge come as a visiting artist. This was before he went to Yale to head the program there.
That's amazing. It's interesting. I feel like that's somewhat of a common thread. At least I can relate to it. I'm sure a lot of people can, where the idea of just taking the camera and kind of, doing your own thing and not necessarily having to be around people. But at the same time, it's interesting how that kind of leads you to other people, in terms of photographing people and things. For the beginning of that era and with the college class that was so instrumental in everything, was the professor, were there peers of yours? Was there anybody who, I guess, sort of played as a mentor or someone who really influenced you as you really became involved with it and just started, kind of finding your own style or approach? Was there anybody who kind of helped shape that in any way?
Well, there were lots of people. I mean, certainly Todd Papageorge was a great mentor and was encouraging and was funny and eloquent. And there were students in the class who were terrific. In fact, the year before Todd had been there, Bill Eggleston had actually been a visiting lecturer. This was at Harvard. And so it wasn't an art school, and he came and but he held most of his classes in the local bar. So I didn't necessarily feel comfortable with that. So I mostly learned about Bill and what Bill thought through my friend Bob Ely, who went to these classes. And so then I would talk to Bob and he would tell me what was happening. So anyway, yeah, there were lots of other students who influenced me as well. So
That's interesting. Was there anything in particular early on that, I guess, drew you towards approaching people and just finding people in, neighborhoods and on the street? Was that something that you were drawn to right from the start, or did you, photograph other things in the beginning and kind of find yourself, that way? Were you always drawn to having people in your work?
no, I really didn't think I was going to be a portrait photographer. I thought, that I might be more like, I don't know, Cortege or someone who just went out into the world and photographed for a variety of things. And I remember so for a senior project, I photographed umbrellas, but I did it. I was influenced by Lee Friedlander, whose book, The American Monument, had just come out. And his approach was to, not photograph the monuments up close, but every picture had a monument in it. But there was usually something, a person or something that referred to the monument, and these very complex frames. And so I was trying to photograph umbrellas in the same way. But of course, people are holding umbrellas. So I started photographing the people, and I started getting more interested in interacting with people and photographing people. And I do think it's sort of that photographers, it's a little bit of an act of overcompensation, that people who are a little shy or not great with people are drawn to photograph people. And people who grew up in New York City are drawn to photograph, landscapes, because all they've known is the city. So it's one of those weird things. I was kind of a shy, slightly introverted kid. And I think photographing people helped me in a lot of ways. And it wasn't just photographically.
You touched on that, on the sort of complex pictures, and briefly in the video I did on your latest book, Passing Time, I talked about something you mentioned there in the introduction, and wanting to make complex pictures. Is that something that you mean in the literal sense of, I guess, filling the frame and including as many details and subjects within the frame? Is it more of how, I guess, complex it can be interpreted? Is it a little bit of both? What is it to you, I guess, when you're looking for finding something complex, or at least making a somewhat complex picture? Is there anything in particular that you try to look for, or things that kind of start clicking for you once you start looking through the frame?
I think I like the challenge of putting as much in the frame as possible, as many people, interesting environments. It was like this challenge. Can I do it? And can it still work? Because it tends to fall apart if you try to do too much. So it's like, oh, maybe I can do this. And but also I was really drawn to environments. And when I was driving around towns or driving around the country, I would usually stop to try to find people if a town was really interesting, if it had, like in Pennsylvania, there are all these coal towns, and there are these backgrounds of, mining going on, and trains carrying coal. Well, I would see that background and I would think, wow, that's really interesting. Maybe I can find people and have that as a background. So I like the idea of layering the pictures, so that really, the idea was people in their environments. The environments were almost as important as the people, to my mind.
Right. Yeah, I love that. In terms of finding those places, did you find yourself, where were some of the main places, I guess, where you tended to find yourself in terms of states, or even, avoiding bigger cities, looking for smaller towns? What did that look like to you? Were you trying to, I guess, go out different from where you were already located, or were you kind of sticking closer to home?
A lot of my work was done within an hour of, at that point I was living in Boston. And so I would usually, go to pick, maybe one day I'd go to South Boston, and another day I'd go to Fall River, which is about an hour south of here. I was kind of drawn to these hilly mill towns, where there were these big old brick buildings, lots of triple deckers, smokestacks, uh, Brockton, Mass, Lawrence, Mass, and around Boston, these towns, Chelsea and South Boston, East Boston, Charlestown. There were a lot of interesting places right around Boston to photograph. So I would pick a neighborhood and go there. And of course, some days you go out and it seems magical. People start saying yes, and you start getting more and more excited. And other days you go out and people say no, and then they say no again. A different person says no, and you realize, I am giving off vibes. I do not want to be out here today. Time to go home and work in the darkroom today. So that's fine. You just have to, realize, okay, it could be a coincidence, but it's probably some vibe I'm giving off, which is I just can't do this today.
Yeah,
So
yeah, just need a change of pace. Uh,
yeah.
in situations like that, at least at that time, did you have an idea in mind for, you're going out with your camera and you're approaching people and you're finding things? Did you have a specific goal, or a home for these pictures in mind, or how was it you, I guess, pitched this to the people that were meeting just in their sort of natural environments? Were you telling people what you had in mind? What did that look like for you approaching people just who weren't expecting you, on any given day?
Well, I told them if they asked, I told them. And they don't always ask. And I learned that don't give people information they don't ask for because it's just asking for trouble, really. But if people said, what's this for? And is this for the local paper? Which back then, you know, there there was nothing online. People were less sophisticated about what someone might be photographing for. There was nothing, and so what occurred to them usually was, oh, it's for the local paper. And so I would say, no, it's not for the paper. I'm taking them for myself. I try to have shows in art galleries. And if I get a picture I think is really wonderful, I might, at some point, it might appear in a book of portraits. Um, and so that was as honest as I could be because I didn't really know. I was young. I didn't have a publisher waiting or anything. So that was what I could tell people. And some people were mystified by that. And most people accepted it as like, okay.
I want to come back to that in a bit, talking about, the way things are today versus how they were now, if you were to just go out with your camera. But you've also mentioned photo books a couple of times, and obviously I don't know how many books you've made at this point. I know I own, I think, at least 6. So photo books clearly are a big part of, your life, your practice as a photographer. Early on, you mentioned as well, looking a lot at photo books. Is that something that once you finally or once you first started getting into them and consuming photo books, was that something that you always kind of had in your mind, something that you'd like to do?
Yes, it was. And I guess, I mean, I love exhibitions. It's great to see prints large on a wall, but in the end, I think that a book is the best realization of a any photographer's particular project, because they've clearly included everything they wanted. They've excluded what they didn't want, and they've sequenced it, or someone has, probably the photographer, not necessarily. But to me, it's their best. It's the best realization of it. And I've always loved sequencing my work. I'm very old school. I spread everything out on my bed and the floor, and I don't find that making a PDF is something that works for me as well. I like to sequence it and move it around on the floor and look at it, and then eventually order a blurb book or something to see if I think it works that way. But and I think as I was going through college and stuff, I looked at a lot of books. I started before college. I looked at stuff like Family of Man, and then in college, I remember Time Life had this series of photo books, and they had something on documentary photography. And I think this one was published in 1972. And I remember looking at that again and again for weeks on end. And then eventually, I started looking more at monographs of, Robert Frank's The Americans, and Gary Winogrand was publishing books, and Lee Friedlander and Diane Arbus. And, I was fascinated with, she goes up to strangers and talks to them. And there's something about her personality that makes those people look the way they do. It's not just them, it's that interaction. And I was really fascinated by that. And also because she was a woman and there weren't a lot of women photographers being exhibited and published back then. So I feel like I've gone astray. I haven't really answered your
No,
question, but
that's perfect. I was curious where, obviously the goal of making photo books, but also just the purpose that they serve, and the value that photo books really serve, I think, for photographers, not just to make, but also to consume, one thing for me being, I don't live near, a bunch of galleries, and the idea of being able to not only see the work, but I can keep it, I can, see it at any time. I can share it with friends. Going to exhibitions, like you said, it's great, but that's one thing I've always loved about the books themselves. In terms of that, you mentioned, how you like to sequence things and everything. I know with passing time, you were revisiting work that was never previously published, and it was from decades ago. And I've always been curious about that for photographers, where it's not work that was, a part of a project or something. It's a whole collection of, everything that they've encountered. What was that like for you to revisit work from so long ago in terms of the time playing a role in that? I think a lot of times photographers will kind of have this back and forth on how long they should sit with the work and, let it marinate, so to speak, before they make something with it and release it into the world. Is that ever, I guess, a key factor for you when you're analyzing pictures? Do you like to distance, the time from making the pictures to actually reviewing them? What does that typically look like for you? And I guess in particular for passing time, what that was like?
Yeah, passing time. I mean, it's something I did during the pandemic when I couldn't go out and ask people if I could photograph them. It was too close and too intrusive. So it was fascinating to go back. I kind of thought I'd looked at everything that I'd done back then, but I had never gone back through all the contact sheets and looked at them carefully. And I found a lot of pictures, some pictures I'd made work prints of, and then some of the work prints I'd torn up, or sometimes I had a work print, but some of them I've never even printed. So I was like, wow, I wonder why I didn't print this back then. And I think partly, I think I'm a better editor I now than I was when I was young of my own work. But I also think it's different when you've just photographed something. What you see when you look at it on the contact sheet is what you didn't get. You remember the day, let's say you took it a few weeks ago. You remember all your hopes for that picture. And what you see is how you failed. And so it's hard to let go of that. You can't just look at it for what it is. On the other hand, you look at a picture where you didn't have any hopes for it and you're pleasantly surprised. You do print that one. So there's an advantage. I mean, I think Lee Friedlander has done a lot of his books going back through his archive and, looking, whatever theme he's working on, pickup trucks, going back and looking through. And it's in hindsight and with historical perspective and with, time having elapsed, it's a lot easier to make those edits, I think. But you need to keep up with it while you're doing it too, though, because you need to get feedback. You do need to keep, printing your stuff and looking at it, because otherwise you're not getting any feedback and you're not getting encouragement of what you might be doing that's good.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I know I've personally talked to photographers who they feel, I've been shooting all of these pictures for years and I haven't done anything yet and it feels like wasted time, but it's clearly you can always revisit it, and it's not wasted time. And like to your point, it can often benefit you if you kind of distance yourself a little bit. I know I'm personally, anytime I see photos that I've made, recently, I'm, like you said, I'm remembering all of those details, and I would have done it this way, I would have done it that way, and minutes later, I've completely ripped everything apart. So I think it is good to kind of distance yourself in that way. Another thing you mentioned that I was curious about, in terms of being a woman as a photographer, as especially at that time. I remember, I think I was watching an interview or listening to an interview with Mary Ellen Mark, and she talked about photographing people in their homes and being welcomed into their homes as if she was, I guess, less threatening because she was a woman and they were, okay with her coming into their home and making pictures. Did that ever come into play for you as a photographer, being a woman? Did you ever find yourself where that was, I guess, an advantage in any way, or even in other ways? Was there ever sort of a disadvantage or anything like that that came into play, especially at the time that you were making these pictures?
I think it was an advantage, definitely. I think people were less threatened, and I think children were less threatened, and people with children were less threatened. And so I think there's that advantage. I think I was probably also taken less seriously because I wasn't a man, which was an advantage and a disadvantage, depending, who I was asking. Um, so it cuts both ways, but I think mostly it's an advantage. And especially now that people are so paranoid, and especially about their children, I think it's definitely an advantage. So
Yeah. Yeah, comparing the time that you were making the pictures versus now, where pictures are being taken and uploaded seconds later, where the whole world can see. Uh, how do you think that that would affect your approach? I guess taking the same approach that you did years ago, do you feel like some of the pictures that you've made, at least some of your favorite pictures or certain environments you found yourself in, do you feel that you would be able to have the same level of, I guess, not only access, but also the subject being comfortable and getting certain expressions or anything like that? How does that, change the way that you worked at the time that you were making a lot of this work?
I think now when I go photograph people, strangers, when I go up to strangers, it's first of all, I'm different. I'm older. I'm a little slower. I tend to move in closer. I do more verticals. Uh, but there's also the feeling of when you ask people, they know a lot, which is good and bad. They know, they think, oh, yeah, your website, and then you can give them your website. They can look you up. You're legitimate. That's nice. You can send them a JPEG rather than mailing them a stack of prints. That's easier, although it's not as nice, I don't think, but you can do that. And but they tend to be more, there's more self-consciousness because they're thinking about YouTube and TikTok and online. And so, and they have their selfie smiles prepared. So you have to either accept that and work with it, or, it takes a little longer to get beyond that. And I think it works better today if you can somehow, make an appointment to photograph someone, and go to their home and spend more time with them. That's a little easier than just going up to someone on the street, and trying to do that because you are met with a lot of self-consciousness. Um, but
Yeah, I like that. It's easy to, at least in my opinion, it's easy for me to look at all of the downsides of that, where people are self-conscious and they're kind of skeptical about where the pictures may be. But to your point, I like that, where you can show the work, that people can look you up right on site and see the work. You easily share for their needs, not for the whole world, but you can share the work with them much easier. So I appreciate you sharing that side as well, because I think a lot of people think, well, it's people are too guarded these days, but there are some benefits, I think, to just the way it
yeah,
works
and
now.
there's a lot of projects where I've found people. Like, for instance, when I was doing Peaceable Kingdom, which was about people who rescued animals, I would find a lot of rescues online and I would email people cold, but I could attach my website. I could attach some JPEGs. I could show people what I was doing. They could look me up. There's a huge advantage in that. Back in the 80s, if you would call someone up cold, you didn't have, they didn't know who you were. And it's much easier to email in advance and then follow up with a phone call. And so there are great advantages, actually.
I hope you're all enjoying this conversation so far, and I want to take a quick break to thank the sponsor of this video, Squarespace. When I first launched my website, mattdayphoto.com, around 10 years ago, I decided to use Squarespace to do that, not only because it's super easy to use, but it has everything you need in one place. You browse through all of their templates to choose from, you find one that you like, and then you just start customizing it yourself. I share work from personal projects using their gallery pages. I have a sign-up form for my email newsletter where I get to share things and update all of you each month. I sell my prints, zines, photo books, everything directly through the online store, which is built into the website. All of these things, everything I do, it's all in one place thanks to Squarespace. If you feel like it might be overwhelming or just too much for you to do yourself, they have 24/7 customer service that are always available. I've used them myself plenty of times. If I can do all of this stuff entirely by myself, I'm sure you can do it too. You can try it out for yourself with a free trial at squarespace.com, but when you're ready to launch the website, go to squarespace.com/mattday and use the code mattday at checkout. That's going to save you 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. for pictures like in Passing Time and even in your other books, a lot of stuff where you're up close with people, it tends to be sort of a wide field of view. Was there anything particular that you were usually using in terms of your equipment for lens choices or focal lengths? Was that something that you tended to stick with, or what was it about? I guess the gear that you were using, the equipment you were using in terms of making the pictures. I know packing a lot of information into the frame and having a wide field of view, I would assume that, played a part in that. But was there sort of a specific camera or lens focal length that you tended to stick with that worked best for you?
Yeah, pretty much for this work and my at home with themselves, same-sex couples work, and also the animals work. I was using the same camera and lens. Was a Fujica G690, which is a 6 by 9 centimeter camera with a wide-angle lens, 65 millimeter lens, which is the equivalent of a 28. And I also back then Fuji made two different cameras. It was a fixed lens camera. You had to buy both cameras, which weren't very expensive, but you had to buy the one with the 65 and the one with the 90. The one with the 90, I didn't use that much. And when I did, I used it mostly to make close-up verticals of people because I never figured out how to use it horizontally. But I have a lot of friends who did use it horizontally very successfully. So yeah, it was that Fujica, which was kind of a camera that so it had a rangefinder, and it wasn't a very accurate rangefinder. You had to kind of get to know what it did, And I was told by I think it might have been Todd George, who said, use the Leica 28 viewfinder, put it on the hot shoe, and that's actually more accurate. So I basically did a lot of zone focusing where I would, say, okay, I want everything from 8 feet to 20 feet to be sharp, and I'm at f16, so I'd look at the depth of field ring and I'd put it there, and I would just shoot looking through the Leica range. So I wasn't focusing really, or I might focus when I first started, and then I would just keep shooting. Which can be a little problematic because sometimes you're a little front or back focused. But if you're using a lot of depth of field, it doesn't matter as much.
Right. Yeah, I was curious about that because just in terms of working with something a little bit wider and getting closer, that's often something people struggle with. They want to use a longer lens and stay far back, but it really plays a big part, I think, in your work showing that you're really there in the environment, up close with people. I guess for any photographers out there today who want to make work where they're going out and they're meeting people for the first time and making pictures of them, or if they're just out looking around and whatever it is they come across, it's fair game. In terms of making work that feels true and authentic to them, is there any sort of advice you would give a photographer who maybe, especially if they aren't already making work, approaching people and they feel, a little intimidated by it and maybe they are a bit more introverted? Do you have any sort of advice from your experience that you could give them?
I mean, I remember getting up my nerve to go up to people and how it was hard. And it's hard because, you're worried people are going to say no. First of all, you're worried that people will feel offended that you're invading their personal space. You're worried they're going to say no. You're worried that you're going to bother them and then you're not going to get a picture that's good enough to have warranted bothering them, all of those things. But I think it's important just to, I do think that if you approach people with sincere interest and you're honest with them about what you're doing, and you're genuinely interested in them, I think people do like to be seen and like to be recognized by other people. Not to worry so much, just be open, show interest, and people will often respond. So don't censor yourself, I guess is what I would say.
Yeah, that's great. I think it's easy for people to assume the worst, right off the bat. But if you have good intentions, I feel like that definitely shows through just in, approach and conversation with people. Everything you've said has been great. I'm super excited for everyone to hear this conversation. So, again, I just want to thank you for taking the time. Huge congratulations on passing time and your recent exhibition as well. I know myself and a lot of people have been loving this book and definitely looking forward to whatever comes next.
Thank you so much, Matt. I really appreciate it. And I appreciate how eloquent you are when you talk about my books and other people's books. It's a great service to the photo community. So thank you.
I appreciate that. That's something that just getting more eyes on work and photo books, especially, that's always the goal. So that means a lot coming from you.
Thanks so much.
I hope you all enjoyed that conversation as much as I did. I came away from it feeling extremely inspired, and I'm just so thankful to have Sage here on the channel. She was just so kind, so sweet, and just couldn't be more thankful for that. So thank you again, Sage, for this interview. It means the world, and I hope you all enjoyed it. So let me know what your thoughts are in the comments down below. If you haven't already picked up any of Sage's books, I highly encourage you to do so. Passing Time is the latest book published by Nazreli Press. Great book, and I have a whole video on that one itself if you're interested. But that's it for today. Thank you all for watching. I love you guys. I'll see you soon.